In Nothing Personal, Lee Neuwirth examines his years working for a controversial Defense Department organization during the Vietnam War. From 1965 until 1977, Lee Neuwirth was Deputy Director of the Institute for Defense Analysis in its Communications Division. A lot of acronyms, IDA, CRD. While he himself was opposed to the Vietnam War and his division had nothing to do with Vietnam, his association with IDA made him suspect. And this will cover the rather tumultuous years of Vietnam, how his family got involved, the university, microcosm of the whole world in our little town of Princeton, you could say. Welcome, thank you for coming.
Happy to be here. I'm flattered that you want to talk to me.
I want to get it down for the record, though. I want to get. Let's just start. You graduated from Princeton in 55.
Chemical engineering degree. Got interested in applied math and went to Columbia for a couple of years. Got a degree in applied math, and then at my wife's urging, I was encouraged to apply to Princeton because I had some ideas about mathematics, and I was accepted and got my PhD in mathematics in 1959.
Wow. And then IDA came about for the reason the government was losing a lot of good people to private businesses?
Well, it was the end of the war, and they had a lot of talent. End of the Second World War, and they had a lot of talent, which they were getting help from, and they were losing that talent. They wanted to maintain expertise. And when the people went into industry, that didn't seem like a good idea to hire people who had a vested interest in the answers that they gave to the questions that the government asked. So, and they thought they would go to the universities, and the universities could provide help, but not on a continuing basis. So what they set up was an organization under an umbrella of 5 universities initially, a consortium of 5 universities, who sponsored IDA. And through that mechanism, they were able to maintain and recruit talent to continue to work on technical problems of difficulty that the government needed help with.
In your case, codes?
We worked on communications problems, codes and ciphers, and in a division which was located outside of the main offices of IDA, which were down in Washington,
D.C.
in Alexandria.
So you come back to
Arlington at the time.
Sorry, you come back to Princeton, and you said Princeton was changing. It was a rural area town to more of a leafy, suburboisie, as I call it, community. Good place.
It was quieter, and you couldn't get anything to eat much after 11 o'clock, and it was all male university. Women imported for the weekends, and it was pretty quiet. You didn't have many tourists coming through.
Right. And you were at Newman Hall, or by Newman Hall?
We were at a building which was built to our specifications and rented to us by the university. That was one of the ties we had with the university, was renting a building on the eastern edge of the campus and paying our rent by means of time on a computer, which was one of the most advanced computers at the time. Now it looks like a joke.
Right.
At the time, it was used by the university. They had a professor in Schwarzschild who was doing star evolution, and he wanted time on a computer, and the university didn't have one, and we did. So we paid our rent.
So it's a win-win. And you're in the CRD again?
Communications Research Division. It was one of 5 divisions at the time.
Now, it sounds pretty idyllic, though. You describe it as egalitarian.
It was a wonderful, wonderful organization. It was ideas were mainly those of a single man. Richard Leibler was his name. He was the first deputy director. He came from the National Security Agency, and he had many ideas about how a research organization should be run. And he was, through IDA's easy management of us at the time, he was able to inculcate his ideas, and we had no ranks on the staff, and papers that were written were authors were listed in alphabetical order, and joint work was encouraged. We had no particular hours. We were just expected to do good work and be paid for it at every 2 weeks. We didn't have a time clock, anything of the sort. We were also encouraged to do our own research because the main talent that was recruited was that of mathematicians. Wow. And for a mathematician to maintain his professional competence, he's got to do mathematics. So we were encouraged to do mathematics in addition to working on the problems, which were very difficult, but fascinating problems.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of paradise in a way. It's a playground.
It was marvelous.
Right.
Some people might refer to it as a sandbox, but we were very serious about working on the government's problems, and we were able to make very important contributions. Otherwise, they wouldn't have renewed the contract, because there was, as you might imagine, a lot of jealousy from the government, because people who were in the government who were working on the same kinds of problems at the National Security Agency, for example, were envious of our working conditions and ease of parking.
Right. Objectivity, you could just,
right.
Pew research to work on problems.
Right. And so we had to overcome a lot of that, and we overcame it in the only way we could, namely by doing good work.
Right. And they couldn't deny you. But now, it's around, let's say, 1965, storm clouds are starting to come up.
Right. We had the Vietnam War was starting to warm up. We still hadn't got a lot of troops in there, but there was an undercurrent of unhappiness with the government and its policies.
Right.
And we had just a little bit of demonstration at our place, a suggestion that the relationship between IDA and the government and the university was suspicious, was looked upon with some suspicion by the people who were unhappy with the government's policies. Mm-hmm.
But you yourself said you grew up during the Good War, and you said you yourself were put off by the sullied lies of the government during the Vietnam era. You were against the war itself.
I was not happy. I was at the beginning when the students were protesting, and there was a lot of noise. I got a number of books and read as best I could on both sides of the issue to try to see what was going on. And it seemed to me that it wasn't a good idea for us to be there, and I was not in favor of us being there, but I continued working because we didn't have anything to do with the war.
That's what, yeah.
The rest of the IDA, they were working on the war. And not always in a way that our accusers would believe. Right.
Your problem was a lot of it was secret. They had to take your word, and then you have SDS coming onto campus.
Right.
You have it turned out you describe it almost. They came on with a scorched earth policy, almost nihilistic, and they really didn't want to hear the other side. It was anarchy for them.
Yeah, they assumed that we were lying, whatever we had to say, and it really didn't matter what we were saying because they wanted to protest the war. And if we hadn't been available, perhaps they would have gone to the post office
to find it.
I don't know, but we were the closest thing, especially our name and the fact that the other divisions were working on the war. They could protest initially their university's connection with IDA, and then what work they thought we were doing, or they could accuse us of doing, and we couldn't defend ourselves very well because our work was classified. We couldn't tell them what we were doing.
But then they stepped up. They started blockading the building.
As the war heated up, so did the demonstrations. There was a parallel path of anger and excitement and agitation, and the demonstrations got more and more vigorous, and they took the form of blockading our building and keeping us from coming into work. And finally, it culminated in an enormous demonstration which lasted a number of days in 1970. And that was further worsened by the Kent State business.
Right. Oh, it's there.
And that demonstration had hundreds of people there, and they blockaded the building, and they threw bricks through the windows and put graffiti all over the building.
Right.
And
There was some fisticuffs too.
No. There was fisticuffs happened at an earlier demonstration. That was a different kind of. I can tell you that little story, but there was very little violence at this 1970 demonstration of that sort.
So continued protest, and you started. What I get from your book, Nothing Personal, you started having really disdain for some of the protesters. You said they really had nothing to lose, everything to gain, not much consequences. A friend of mine had a very wise thing to say. He said, you should be very suspicious of people whose opinions cost them nothing. Right.
And their opinions cost them nothing. And our work wasn't on the war, but we were employees of IDA, and they found us a convenient target.
Right.
They could always demonstrate against Nassau Hall and the university's policies. That was a place to register their unhappiness with the university, and IDA was a place where they could register their unhappiness with the government and its policies.
Symbolic. So now it's by 70.
It was symbolic, but the symbols weren't so happy.
And that's
it's not so much fun being a symbol.
And as you said, not for you or your family, your wife got abused, Dr. Leibler's kids were threatened.
Right.
And you said by 71, Princeton, I found this kind of poignant or perceptive, Princeton had found itself with institutions designed for people who are no longer here.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Women started coming in, right. Different types of students.
They had all kinds of tradition and things were set up for the last generation. I guess it's always that way. They're always lagging a little bit behind.
But it was almost like a time warp. And you were still catching a lot of heat, going to work, all that kind of stuff. Labeled a baby killer in a way.
Right.
And all the terrible.
Various so-called friends didn't see anything wrong with labeling us with sobriquets, which were uncomplimentary, I would say.
And they kept on coming back by saying nothing personal, which I do find a little disingenuous. They would
their feeling was that they didn't have anything personally against us, but we shouldn't be in town, and we should. It's funny because even if we had left town, we would have kept on doing what we were doing. So they somehow wanted to purify the town. Don't let them work here.
Right. Feel better about themselves.
Feel better about yourself if you work someplace. If we were someplace else where they couldn't see us or something. I think it would have been very disappointing for them if they didn't have a place in which they could protest.
For that time.
At that time, yes.
Now we move on. The university was somewhat, according to your book,
yes.
Nothing Personal, still available on Amazon. The university was was somewhat disingenuous
Paperback.
too. Paperback. Easy, good read. Your rent lease was going to be up.
Right.
And you didn't really see that. You saw them as disingenuous and wanting you, not wanting you. What was that about?
Well, our lease had a clause in it. The lease was for 10 years, starting in 1960, with an option to renew for 5 more years in 1968. We had to let them know a couple of years ahead of time if or not, whether or not we were going to renew. And there was some agitation at the time where we could make our decision, but we decided that we were going to renew it. That was in 68. Then in 1970, they had this big demonstration, and they decided that they would pressure us so that we would leave early.
Was it President Goheen at the time? Or
Goheen was the president.
they were cutting the losses, so to speak. They had other things to worry about, and this would be one less.
They had a lot of things to worry about. The university was not in great financial shape at the time.
Oh.
And they asked us, they suggested to us that we should leave earlier. And so we said, IDA said, we would make a study and see how much it would cost for us to leave early. Because this was in a favorable time for our lease. This was at the end of the lease, and computer time was worth less and less because the computers were getting faster and faster. So the computer time that we had negotiated early in the lease was no longer as valuable. But we're giving them the same number of hours. Wow. We got a new computer, and we were able to negotiate with that. And our bean counters down in Alexandria made a computation, and they decided that if we left 3 years early, which we would have had to do, it would cost $600,000, which was an enormous sum of money at that time, especially the university, which was not doing so well financially. So when they heard that, they went ballistic. They were very unhappy, and the Goheen absolutely refused to pay anything, and the government said that they're not going to pay.
So you're staying.
We're not going to pay. But there was there was a big meeting with a lot of important people.
Lawrence Rockefeller.
And Bill Burden, all kinds of important people were at the meeting. And at the meeting it was suggested that since it was the faculty and the students that wanted us to leave early, why don't the students pay? I thought that was a great idea, but that's obviously not impractical idea.
Well, the universities always put a little additional money if you pay for it. You don't even know what they're for, so why not? I thought that was funny. But.
Right. So we stayed those extra till the end of the lease, till 1975. But in 1972, there was the harbor at Haiphong was mined, and the bombing was stepped up in North Vietnam, and we had another demonstration. By this time, we had gotten wise and put a fence around the building, so they couldn't come close to the building.
And were the state police involved in?
No,
it's still not.
State police were never called. That's people. Some people still think that the state police were called. In fact, I had a call with Rudenstein.
Dean.
Not so long ago, in which he thought that the state police, but they were never called. No. But anyway, the police. There was a fence around the building in 1972, but the demonstration then was very different than the demonstration in 1970. In 1970, there were a lot of kids there, from the high school, from the university, from Rutgers, from nearby places, because they had a band and there was wine drinking.
It was a party.
It was a party, a certain amount of smoking. There was a lot of serious unhappiness about the war, and there was some of that, but there also was a lot of fun. This 1972 demonstration was not fun. There were townspeople, there were faculty, and there were not so many smiles, and there wasn't a band. There was a band in 1970. They got a bunch of guys down here to play music for them. There was no band, and while there were no arrests in 1970, there were hundreds of arrests in 1972. That was a much more serious demonstration, and it involved adults.
And they had to be processed. It was a major scene.
Yes, and several buses were brought up to take the people away that were arrested, and Some people were arrested twice, some people 3 times, so it was difficult to count the number of arrests.
What struck me in the book was there was
multiplicities.
Yeah, what struck me in the book then, there were consequences that time. People were tired on both sides of the nonsense.
Right. And we took a lot of flack in 1970 from townspeople who were very annoyed that we didn't call the police and throw the kids in jail for vandalizing the building and restore order, as it was.
Some of the police even said at that time that we ate crow. We could have been much more aggressive, but we weren't.
Right. We had many conversations with the police, the management, local management at IDA, and the police were tried to be on the same page.
If you can touch on this, so during this time, if I have my timeline right, Daniel Ellsberg comes to Richardson Auditorium.
That was 73.
73, okay.
This was after the demonstrations. Ellsberg came to town, and there was a group called the Citizens in Search of Peace, one of the 3-letter acronym groups, CSP.
Many acronyms in this book.
Many acronyms. Anyway, the Citizens in Search of Peace were circulating a petition that they wanted us out of town. They didn't want us moving into town, and they were obstructing our efforts to move to a new building, which was going to be in the township.
Right.
So at that, there was a lot of agitation among the citizens at that time, and Daniel Ellsberg was in the middle of his trial. I guess there was they had called a brief hiatus or something. Anyway, he came to town, to Alexander Hall.
Oh, Alexander Hall. Okay.
Big part.
Alexander, okay.
Alexander Hall. And the place was packed. He just packed the place. And they were passing this petition around to keep us out of town, which I thought was poor form.
And you asked him, you stood up and you said,
Well, at the end of his talk, which was very well received, he asked for questions, and my hand shot up, and I asked him if he had given all the classified information, decided on all the classified information that the people should see, or did he have more?
And he said?
He said, no, but let me ask you a question. And sort of at that time, I don't remember exactly the order of things, but I was identified as a official from IDA, and there was some interference by other members of the audience. And then he said to me, do you think you should show all the... Do you see your... I don't remember exactly what he said. It's in the book, but something about... do you see your work at IDA as give you the right to lie, something like that? And I said, I don't lie. And we went back and forth a little bit, and I said, I didn't come here to debate you. And he said, I'd be happy to debate you. And I said, okay, but I'm not speaking for IDA. And with that, with some trepidation, I went to the stage, and
the informal debate began.
We had a little informal debate. Now, he was all warmed up. He had been talking for 3/4 of an hour, and I wasn't warmed up. And he was a professional talker, and I was not a professional talker. And he knew his subject very well. I knew what I knew. And the audience, needless to say, was very much on his side, at least initially. So the debate was hardly equal. Mm-hmm. As we debated, he would ask me a question and I would ask him a question. When he asked me a question, I was very succinct in my answers. And when I asked him a question, he made a speech. So...
grand oratory.
Yeah. I made a couple of good points. 1 or 2 good points. But
the main one was what? About selective information?
The main one was the following. I said, do you think the United States should have an army? And he said, yes. I said, do you think it should be a good army? He said, yeah. He said, what do you mean, good? He said, something like that. And I said, well equipped with the most modern weapons, result of good research.
Evolving Cold War.
Yeah. Well, I didn't say that.
Oh.
No. I didn't want to get into that. But it just said, try to make it obvious that a place like IDA would be needed. And his response was pretty poor. He said, well, in my idea, what we would need to defend would be a very different kind of IDA. And so he didn't give a good answer. That was the best point I made. But at the end of our back and forth, I got a big round of applause.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't get that from the book at all. But your
They
idea...
were the audience was somehow behind me.
And also receptive for once.
Receptive in some kind of way. There was a big round of applause that I got. And he whispered to me, if we were keeping score, I think you would have won.
Very gracious.
He would say, yeah.
But your IDA masters were not that happy. You said later.
The IDA was happy.
Oh, really? I thought when you came back, you got a little lecture.
No, IDA was happy. But when I went down to the government, went down to NSA, they were very unhappy.
Why so? They just didn't want things public? They didn't want you out there?
They weren't happy with my being out there. They were very shy. It's a group that's was at the time, very publicity shy. They don't like to be in the public eye.
Which leads
that was number one.
Right.
But the guy who was running our contract, a guy named Howard Rosenblum, was he went over the transcript of the debate, because they had a transcript of the whole debate. He went over it line by line, and he showed me all the places where I could have scored and where he was taking advantage of me and so forth and so on. He was very critical of my performance. So.
Yeah, well, as you said too, unfortunately, it wasn't like you warmed up and knew that was going to happen.
There was that, and I thought I did okay, and my family was pleased, and IDA was pleased. I was moderately happy with what I did, but my performance was not an A+. So.
One question that came out, and other people asked me, Dr. Leibler didn't want to... Explaining yourself who you were, it seems like you tried to explain IDA numerous times. Do you think it could have done a better job, or would it make any difference if Dr. Leibler had come out and said, look, we're not part of Vietnam, we don't know?
No. It would make no difference whatsoever. They were not interested in that. And there is a kind of, why is it necessary? Why do you have to justify what you're doing just because somebody says they don't like what you're doing and they don't know what you're doing? The idea of defending your morals to somebody is antithetical to our democracy. A guy doesn't have to defend himself. If a person is doing something wrong, then accuse him of doing something wrong, put him on trial if he's doing something illegal, and he's innocent until he's proven guilty. Right. The idea that you have to justify something that you're doing is inappropriate, at the very least. So that question came up in our moving into town.
That leads us, yes. Now you deal with the gown, now you get the town.
Right. That's a good point, yeah, right. And we had to deal with the town, and dealing with the town was a whole different kind of thing, because without any kind of controversy, getting a building permit was not an easy job.
They called a special adversarial meeting or something to discuss?
Right. They called a meeting to talk about our activities, and there were all kinds of objections thrown in the way of our moving. Environmental things were
water runoff,
seized upon, right. Water runoff, all kinds of things. And finally, the mayor said, enough is enough. And, they gave us a permit, and we went ahead. People in the town who were still opposed to our moving into town contacted the congressman, their local congressmen and senators, but they had no argument. At
the end of the day, it was still like you can get a building, you get a zone, you go to planning, right. Zoning.
Right. And you tell them what you're going to do. It's an office building. We're going to do this kind of research. You don't have to prove that you're not raising chickens or you're not building bombs.
Right. at that time, I knew some of the. I lived in the neighborhood where that was still do now, and yeah, they were almost. I have to say, hopefully I'm being somewhat objective. They were kind of a self-righteous zeal to their what they were saying, and when I talked to people at that time, they said, Miss Dr. Neuwirth might mean well, but the military-industrial complex is opaque, and at the end of the day, we don't know what's going on. So how could we trust it?
Well, well, that's right. How could they trust us?
Right.
Well, too bad.
Yeah.
You know, we're doing something, and the government is paying us, and if you think we're doing something illegal, then take us to court or something, right?
Right. And where is the proof? I did say in the long term now, we're talking now over 40 years later, where is the proof of like genocide, atrocities, pre-planned, meditated, that they associated you all with? Right. And they haven't, has it come out yet? That Dr. Leibler, Dr. Neuwirth, CRD is involved in?
Building bombs in the basement and so forth and so on, and doing all kinds of noxious research. And we weren't, but you have to engage in a morals matching game with people. They're.
I call it. They wanted to be your moral accountant without you being part of the actuary. They were their actuaries.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. I should hire you as a PR.
Well, I only see you. I call it as
I like
I see
that.
it.
Moral accountant.
Yeah,
that's
but
very good.
That's what I said when I talked to some of these people. They'll go nameless right now because I don't want to be sued. But I go, you sound like their moral accountant. You really don't have all the information, and you're assuming a whole lot. Right. A whole lot.
I'll give you one example. There was a paper written, not at our facility, but down in Alexandria, or Arlington at the time. And the title of the paper was On the Use of Thermonuclear Weapons in Southeast Asia. And the students hit upon that as a proof of how bad we were, that we were studying the use of thermonuclear weapons in Southeast Asia. Just on the title. They didn't know what was in the paper.
They didn't read the resolution, the conclusion.
They couldn't read the paper because it was classified, but they had the title, which was sufficient for them. Well, it turns out that paper was written to strongly urge the non-use of nuclear weapons in Southeast Asia on all kinds of grounds.
And that has come out. It wouldn't help them win ethically and morally. It's not going to.
And perhaps that kept us from using thermonuclear or nuclear weapons in Southeast Asia. I don't know, but that's an example of where they latched on to a little bit of information, and they decided, and they leaped to the conclusion that we were advocating the use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Somewhat biased. So that leads us to, you have what I call the insider knowledge with outsider sensitivity. Plus, like a mathematician, you seem to be so fair. You seem to be objective, and you want to be analytical. So you read this. Oh, you read this book by Seymour Martin Lipset, Rebellion of the Universe. Were you trying to make sense of this whole thing? Was the protest worth it?
Yeah.
You were trying to see their side.
The whole thing is. This whole thing was stirring around in my head. What good are these protests? Are these protests? I understand that they're against the war. I'm against the war, but to what end are these protests? Are these protests doing any good?
Will the ends justify the means of any type?
I couldn't and still cannot believe that a more peaceful approach to the demonstrations would have been as effective, or perhaps more effective, at least as effective, if they had just gone to our place and quietly picketed us, engaged us in conversation, tried to talk to us about how we should support their opposition to the war, that our opposition to the war could be made, could be crystallized into some kind of explicit actions. If they had been more rational about it, rather than painting graffiti on the building and throwing bricks through the window, which alienates a whole lot of people and is not going to change anybody's mind.
You thought it was more counterproductive then, in your opinion?
Yes. Wouldn't it have been more effective? I believe it would have been more effective. And to this day, I believe that. But, there are all kinds of reasons people were at that at those demonstrations. And who knows what motivated the guy to get up on a ladder and spray obscenities onto the building. All kinds of things may have been involved in that guy's behavior and the other people's behavior.
But something to chew on. I talked to some other people, and again, this is more subjective. They said without raw, crude violence or rebellion, the government would never have gotten would not have paid attention. That's what they say. Without the Kent State, without the Princeton University, without blowing up ROTC buildings.
Well, and they can believe that. I don't believe it.
It's hard to prove in a sense too.
It's a hypothetical. I don't think it's the case. Congressional action and the political pressures and withholding money for the war, and all kinds of things could have changed things. It's certain. I think it's the case that massive demonstrations had an effect. They definitely had an effect, but violent demonstrations, I think, have a counter effect.
To most people.
100,000 people assembling on the Mall in Washington peacefully, I think, has a much more positive effect than 100 people throwing rocks and behaving illegally.
Right. Just a side note, I remember my grandfather saying the war is going to end soon, and I said, why? And he goes, the Wall Street Journal came out against it. It was like in 1971. That too. So then you go to Thanet Road. Now, IDA's now passed on. It's in another leafy place, possibly off, Bun Drive. Anyway, they have a nice, probably doing good work.
This is the second place they went.
Yeah.
The first place they went was at a place off Terhune, and which was a little distant from the university, but still within walking distance. There was one demonstration there. And
they gave the wrong direction, so how to get there from here?
Yeah, but they managed to get there, and they had a small demonstration. Mm-hmm. But following that, we moved still further up Bun Drive in 2000.
With all that said, I guess as we wrap up, the attention span of today's generation. I mean, your book has great footnotes, great details. A lot of people don't like that these days. Maybe they should, but that's another story. You I don't want to get too mawkish, but you wrote your book, Nothing Personal. Within score settling, but you're making a point that things were unfair. You think you're unfairly treated. How do you want to remember about your actions during that? How do you want your grandkids to know about what your legacy was, about how you responded to reactions like that? And do you think this could happen again? I mean, what lessons could be learned?
Absolutely. Certainly can be happened again. I don't think people are, for the most part, disciplined enough in general to maintain nonviolent demonstrations when they're passionate about something. It's very, very hard, and there's always a fringe. So I think it could happen again.
And people could be uninformed.
How do I want to be remembered? I guess that I was thoughtful about the activities, that I didn't do things thoughtlessly. I was rational.
In a time of crisis, in a time of
passion. Yeah, for the most part.
Well, from a mathematician, that sounds very good. Dr. Neuwirth, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
And hopefully that your story, again, is going to be told, hopefully now on Princeton TV for forever.
That's a long time.
Yeah.